Well, thank you for joining us for Brownfield Funding for Redevelopment Minnesota. We get to really share kind of where we're at for each of our programs and really talk about different funding opportunities that are available to you here in the state. So I'm going to let Kristen kick us off.
Great. So I'm going to just introduce myself and hand it over to the other panelists, and then I think we're going to turn our cameras off, or at least I am, just to save on some of that. And then, we can pop back in at the end. And then we also have the chat function available too, if you have questions throughout the presentation that you want to leave, or I think there's a little hand raising icon at the bottom. So there's opportunities and we'll have questions and everything at the end. But I'm Kristen Lukes and I'm with the Department of Employment and Economic Development. And as you see on the screen, there's 4 different program representatives that are here today joining us. So I'm going to start with Martha, and if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, everyone. Martha Faust. I'm a redevelopment manager within Ramsey County's Department of Community and Economic Development. And I have responsibility for our environmental response fund, as well as some other redevelopment programs within Ramsey County. And I think next up is Michael.
Hi, Michael Torres, Hennepin County. I'm a senior environmentalist in the Contaminated Lands Unit, and we're basically Hennepin County's internal consultant for Hennepin County properties. Marcus.
I'm Marcus Martin. I'm representing the Metropolitan Council and the Community Development Department. I will be commenting on information about the Livable Communities Tax-Based Revitalization Account. So we are going to cover a lot of material, but don't worry that all attendees here will get a copy of the presentation afterwards. I know that's a very common question. All right, well, the first step when considering whether to apply for a grant is to select a site. We want you to identify what you know about the existing conditions at the site. We will want to know if there are any recognized environmental conditions or RECs for the site. If you identify a REC, it may cost extra to fix, or it may slow the pace of development, but is your project still feasible under those conditions? If you aren't sure, or you can't answer those questions to the level needed to proceed, you may be a good candidate for an environmental investigation grant. So the goal is to help you know whether there are environmental concerns you need to address when you are planning for redevelopment. And if you have some concerns, get answers to questions like, what types of contamination do you need to manage? How much is there? How much will it cost before you can proceed with construction? So next, Kristen's just going to talk to us just about the general framework.
Sure. So when each of the grant programs recommends grants, we consider a lot of questions such as these. So like, what are the current site conditions? What are the future development outcomes? And we'll get kind of more into what that means in a little bit. And then we really look at, readiness. How soon are the investigation or the development activities going to begin and be completed? And has the applicant clearly shown a need for public funding? So each agency here is offering funding for environmental investigation, and they all have their own priorities for awarding grants. So as you can see, many of the priorities are similar among 2 or more of the grantors, like for instance, focusing on sites that are likely to be the most contaminated. But we're going to look at the criteria for each organization. And these aren't all the criteria that we score on. These are just kind of some of the main scoring criteria that we have. So I will go ahead and start. So for DEED, we're looking for sites that have the highest probability of having contamination. So if you're applying for an investigation grant and your site has always been a farm and you have no indication that that site had any kind of activities on it, that would result in contamination, that would not be a high probability of contamination. So we look at that. We also look at the future construction project or what has the potential to be developed at the site. So with that, we'll look at what do you think the site could be, and will it create jobs? Will it create an increase in tax base? So is it like a commercial development? Like what kind of development do you foresee happening at that site? Knowing full well at the investigation stage, you might not have a whole lot of that information, but the more you know, the better you are. And then lastly, and importantly, is your project ready to begin? Our investigation terms are 2 years, so we want to make sure that you can get that whole process completed within that time frame.
So for investigation grants, the Metropolitan Council is looking for projects that are also highly likely to be contaminated. They could also be vacant or promote redevelopment or reuse of an existing building. And we're looking for locations that are near good transit or offer alternatives like walking or biking. We're also looking for sites that support equitable environmental protection. So these might be areas that have a disproportionate number of contaminated sites nearby, or are helping communities that have had fewer cleanups than expected given the local need. Other things that we look at, we consider the development potential to increase the tax base and add jobs or affordable housing. You know, at the investigation stage, we know that there might be some high variability on these factors, but those are things that we'd be interested in if you know them. We will also be looking at any feedback from community engagement that helps shape the potential development or participate, how that feedback and those individuals participate on the project team. And just like Kristen said, how ready the project is to start are very short. You have 1 year to spend an investigation grant. Michael is going to tell us about Hennepin County and what they're looking for in environmental investigations.
Yeah, so for county investigation grants, we're looking for affordable housing. You're thinking something along the lines of 30 to 80% AMI. Economic development, establishing full-time employment is a high priority. Looking at property values, current versus current taxes versus estimated future potential. Similarly, high probability of contamination, historical use that may have contributed, and again, sustainability is really important aspect to stormwater controls management, solar, and transportation options.
All right, moving on to Ramsey County then. So we're pretty similar to our partners with some slight. So for investigation grants, Ramsey County is looking for projects that, as you can see, prioritize jobs and affordable housing. I would actually maybe flip that, or in the grid. Affordable housing is really our board's highest priority right now, with an emphasis on production and rehab of the 30% AMI level and those kind of deeper level affordability. But additionally, we're looking for projects that will support job growth, taxes, project readiness, and then high probability of contamination. And then a couple of things that are new for us is emphasizing projects located in environmental justice areas as defined by the MPCA. And then historically, Ramsey County has had a tendency, it's not a mandate, but to split investments approximately 50% between St. Paul and suburban Ramsey County. And so next up, Marcus is going to take us through a project example.
All right, thank you, Martha. So let's look at an example of a site that required an extensive environmental investigation when planning for redevelopment. This is the former Northrop King commercial area in northeast Minneapolis. So in this example, we are going to look at the type of investigations, eligible for grants and other public support, the activities you can pay for with an investigation grant, when the activities need to occur to use a grant, and the types of priorities that a a project likely to be selected for a grant, and then aspects related to the costs. So there are many local sources for environmental investigation, including state, regional, county funds here represented here today, and also nonprofit assistance. So for this example, we're going to focus on two types of investigation grants from DEED and the Metropolitan Council. And we will get into details about investigation grants for projects located in Ramsey County a little bit later on. So let's start with what we know about the Northrop King site at the time that they applied. So knowing this site had been used for industrial purposes since the 1920s, and the presence of multiple fuel oil tanks and rail that are often associated with spills and leaks, there was reason to suspect contamination would be found on the site. So just like Michael brought up earlier. The property owner did some preliminary testing on the site before approaching us. They were focusing testing on soil vapor, and looking for asbestos and lead-based paint, chlorinated biphenyls, BCBs, within the vacant parts of the building. So they really were looking at just the accessible areas, just a little bit to see, okay, is there anything here based on what we suspect? So that preliminary testing showed that there was a need to find out more about the contamination below ground and above ground within the existing buildings. How did that affect grants? Well, the city of Minneapolis applied for two separate investigation grants for the Northrop King site. They started with an application to DEED focusing on contaminants underground, followed by a second investigation request to the Metropolitan Council focusing on contaminants in the building and on some of the conditions that they identified in the prior DEED-funded investigation. So I will say that it is unusual to see multiple investigation requests. Most of the investigations sites rather should only request funding from a single source. But as you can kind of see from this historic photo from the aerial there, it is a large industrial site and it had many buildings to assess. So that made this one a candidate for more. Investigation grants, they require a matching cost. So in this case, the preliminary work was done soon enough. Remember, they came in, they did a little bit of stuff beforehand. They did it soon enough by the same developer to qualify for part of the required 25% matching cost. However, additional investigation costs to be paid with grants must occur after the grant is awarded. So timing is a factor to keep in mind when you're looking at options for using grants. Kristen is going to take us through a typical investigation budget. Kristen?
So the Northrop King redevelopment site applied for a DEED investigation grant in the spring cycle of 2020. And this is just an example of some of the budget information that's required to apply for a grant. The city, who is our applicants, all of our applicants are public entities, but the city applied on behalf of the developer for some of the activities that they were looking to get funding for was a work plan for all additional investigation costs. They were looking for additional soil vapor investigation costs, additional soil investigation, and developing a cleanup plan or a response action plan or RAP, and then some related MPCA fees that go along with that. So for us, all of our investigation grants require a minimum of 25% local match. In this case, the developer had already completed a preliminary phase 1 and phase 2 the year before. So for us, prior investigation costs that are incurred before a contract is executed with DEED, are only included as part of that 25% match. So bring it back to Marcus.
All right, wonderful. So let's go back to our flow chart, our decision tree. We looked at an example using DEED and Metropolitan Council investigation grants, but there are other options. So depending on the location and other grant priorities, you may apply to one of the many local environmental grant programs shown here.
Great, I'm going to walk you through some of the aspects of those. So for DEED, we have about $500,000 a year that we can put toward investigations statewide. the maximum grant award for a single site is $50,000 or 75% of the investigation costs, whichever is less. So, and I just wanted to add for D, like I said in the last slide, that any costs that are incurred before your contract are match only for the investigation grants. And this is kind of a new thing that DEED has been doing. It has to do with our state contract law, but if you had an investigation grant in the past, we have reimbursed you for that, and we can't do that anymore. So Marcus, what about you guys, Met Council?
So we have similar grant limits and matching amounts as D does. We, as you can see here, it's 50,000 maximum. We have that same 25% match. We offer half of the total that we're for the year. We're proposing 250,000. So that's 125,000 investigations this spring. Michael, how about at Hennepin County?
Yeah. So for Hennepin County, the amount varies. If you represent a nonprofit, you should apply through Minnesota Brownfield gap financing program. The maximum investigation request to Minnesota Brownfield is around 25,000 per site. If you do not represent a nonprofit, you could apply directly to Hennepin County. The maximum request is 50,000, and there's no match required. We also have other assessment funds that are available on a revolving basis for nonprofits and government units. About Ramsey County.
Yeah, this is new for us. We haven't funded investigation expenses in the past. So there's a little bit of squishiness in terms of like hard and fast limits. This will be the first grant round that we've offered that. And so I think I've put in some kind of maximum per site amounts and then maximum awarded per year. Honestly, it's just too early for us to say. It's really going to depend on the flows and demand and applications. We are definitely taking a more flexible approach than we have with our IRF funds in the past. So I guess I would say to folks that are thinking about seeking investigation funds for Ramsey County, just feel free to give a call and talk through your project so we can help you with that. Before we move on, I did want to note that we had a question in chat that I'm not sure all the panelists saw, and I didn't know if we wanted to answer those kind of as they come up. There's a question from Russ Adams. And do you want me to read that and we could maybe answer that now?
Sure. Let's pause for a moment and take that question, and then we can do that again later as more questions come up too.
So, and then folks that are tuning in, please just continue to put your questions in chat and we'll try to get to them as they come up. So Russ asks, how often are we seeing brownfield redevelopments resulting in provision of affordable housing, given that cleanup of those lots must meet a higher standard in order to host residential development? I can take a quick first crack at that, but I'm sure the other grantors have thoughts as well. It's a great question. And obviously the costs for developing affordable housing are really high, given the amount of gap that needs to be filled to drive down rent levels and so on. But the good news is that, yeah, I mean, in Ramsey County, all of our land is developed. So everything's redevelopment, and regardless of what the project is, there's probably going to be some sort of impacts involved. And I can think of, I've only been managing the IRF now for the last 6 months, but later in the presentation, we'll show one project, Amber Union in Falcon Heights, that recently received IRF funds. And then in our most recent grant round, we had 2 out of 4 applications were for affordable housing projects, some of which were down to 30% of AMI. So that's kind of Ramsey's perspective. I don't know if others have other thoughts.
So Russ, I'll say for the Metropolitan Council's perspective, as you can see in our prior slide, it is also a priority in affordable housing, supporting affordable housing if they are located on brownfields. So we do see a lot of applications for that use, and we do successful redevelopments like that. We're going to show some examples of that later on. So maybe what we'll do here now is move on to Kristen, and she can tell us about a source that is not represented by the panel here today.
Sure. So the last, you can see the last sort of row in this matrix is the MPCA targeted Brownfield assessment program. And that, as it states, is run through the MPCA. They are expecting some additional fund after October, so they wouldn't have necessarily funds available for this May grant cycle. But this program is run a little bit differently from the other grant programs that you're hearing from today, whereas it's not a grant where they, you hire your own contractor. The MPCA actually does the contracting and completes the work for you and then gives you a report at the end. So it's run a little differently. So the Minnesota Targeted Brownfield Assessment Program is run through the MPCA's VIC program. Parties apply to that program on a rolling basis, so it's not like our kind of times that some of the rest of us have. And again, the MPCA uses their own contractors to complete the investigation work and then gives the applicant a report telling them the level of contamination at the site. So that grant can also pay for hazardous material surveys inside buildings. So for them, the eligible applicants are municipal governments, county governments, tribes, and nonprofit organizations. So parties that aren't eligible are those sites that have responsible parties or are active Superfund sites. But it's important to note that the MPCA is looking for all types of sites. So they'll even look at sites that will turn into greenfield sites like parks and trails and open space. They primarily focus on sites outside of the metro area just because there's so many other funding sources available in the metro area. And then they are also looking for sites that are within environmental justice areas of concern. And if you, on their website, you can go on their environmental justice page to see if your community is listed or your project's listed in one of the environmental justice communities. And they also will look at sites where there is no redevelopment plan, which is a little bit different from the rest of the ones you've heard of today. So they like to brag also that their application is the shortest application of all of ours, and it's only 4 pages long. And so if you have questions, you can call or email Shauna Schmidt at the MPCA, and we're going to have her contact information at the end, along with her phone number or her website. So moving to the next.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. It's a lot, but it is a creative alternative if you think some of these other ones don't. So with information from an environmental investigation, you can estimate how much it will cost to fix a problem. Thinking about your redevelopment plans, you want to reconsider, is the project feasible without additional financing? Let's say you got one of these grants. So your answer actually might be yes. Not all environmental assessments turn out to be worst case scenarios. This may be all you need to assess the feasibility of the brownfield cleanup for your redevelopment. For example, housing projects like the Cameron and North Loop, that they received an environmental investigation grant, but they didn't need a cleanup grant. But for many projects, if contamination is found, it can prevent development from proceeding as planned. So next we're going to go over the suggested process if you know that it is contaminated. So more information is needed to apply for a cleanup grant than any other type of grant. You need to have selected your site, just like we've seen before, completed your environmental investigation, including identifying anyone or a group that is likely to have contaminated the site, what we call responsible parties. You need to know how much the cleanup will cost, and you've finished your redevelopment plans. You need to have enrolled in a voluntary cleanup program if you're doing any cleanup underground or with soil vapor, and received an approval of that cleanup plan from the regulatory authority, like the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And this is all before submitting your application. And in most cases here, in terms of, rather in case of deed or Metropolitan Council, you need to find a public applicant. Now, you can do that also with the county programs or apply directly. So it takes some time to do all those things. We put some estimates up here on what people have told us how long that can take. So here are some options. Kristen's going to go over those.
So yeah, just like with investigation funding, there's 4 options to apply for cleanup funding, and those are through DEED's contamination cleanup program and the other programs that you've heard of today. And we're going to each run through the details of that. There is another option for funding that's not listed here and that we're not going to cover today, but there is direct federal funding through the EPA that they offer periodically for cleanup funding. So when each of the grant programs recommends grants, we consider some of these same questions that we kind of looked at for the investigation grants, such as what are the current site conditions? What are the future development outcomes like jobs, taxes, some of those things, affordable housing? How ready is the site to begin cleanup and begin and complete development? And has the applicant clearly shown a need for public funding? So again, each agency is offering funding for cleanup and has their own priorities for awarding their grants. And in much like investigation, remember that many of the priorities are similar and there's a lot of overlap, but there's also some differences. So we're going to look at the criteria for each organization, starting with DEED. So again, these aren't all of our scoring criteria, but some of the most important ones that we look at. So we look at sites that are highly contaminated and that the cost to remove the contamination is high. We look for that. I mean, we score all of our sites on what is that future development going to be. We're the economic development department, so we really are looking at what is that end use, and is that end use going to add jobs? Is it going to increase the tax base? Readiness is a big issue for us. We want to know that your grant is going to be able to start. We have grant rounds every 6 months. And ideally, it would be great if your project is ready to go and can start within that 6 months before that next grant round. If you're not going to be able to start within like a year, then you're probably applying too soon. Like there's another grant round in 6 months, and maybe that's a better fit for you. So, and then we also, we look at need too, and the local commitment. So we want to know that the market can't just cover these costs, and that the city, we have local support from the city. The city does not have to pay the match. And I see there is a question here. I'm just going to go ahead and address it in the chat, which is, can match be in kind, such as staff time or money brought forward by the developer or property owner if the funds are being passed through to a business or property owner? So for DEED, and I think for most of the grantors, and people can answer that themselves, but we don't accept in kind, because how it works for us is DEED is a reimbursement program. So if you do some cleanup work and submit a invoice to DEED for, I don't know, $100, we're going to cut you a check for $75. So you're going to have to pay that other $25 somehow, and it's not going to be with, I mean, it's going to need to be cash money. So can that match come from the developer? Some of it can, and I don't know if we have a slide on this later, but we can get deeper into the weeds on the match a little bit later. But for now, let's look at an example of a cleanup project in Maple Grove. So the city of Maple Grove applied for a DEED grant for the former Hilger transfer site in fall of 2017. So from the street, it kind of looked like a hilly field. It started as a gravel pit and was later used as an unpermitted dump in like the 50s through the mid 70s, and later became a waste transfer site from the mid 70s up until the early 2000s. So the project site is located in an area partly slated for industrial development, known as the gravel mining area. So let's just kind of compare this site to some of our scoring criteria that we have. So the reason why this site was funded was, first, it was highly contaminated. There was over $5 million in estimated cleanup costs. And again, although it maybe doesn't look like it, sometimes the brownfield sites can be deceiving because sites that look really contaminated might not be, and some that look like a grassy field, like this one, were highly contaminated with VOCs, PAHs, PCBs, the whole alphabet soup, metals, other hydrocarbons in soil. So there were also some spots found with buried asbestos as well, and there were also high levels of methane coming from the dump materials underground. It was anticipated that the new office warehouse was going to add over $200,000 to the tax base and potentially up to 400 new high-wage jobs. The site had a high need for public support given the high cost of cleanup. Nearly 30% of the total development cost was for cleanup. And they already had secured TIF or tax increment financing for the project and also a private construction loan. So they're pretty ready to go that way. Now here's what the site looks like. So in total, they got 4 grants, 2 from DEED and 2 from the Met Council. And I'll just kind of take a second to talk about that. So while they started their cleanup, they ran into an unknown black sticky substance, an unidentified substance, and it increased their cost by quite a bit. So they did reapply to DEED and Met Council for cost overruns on that site to deal with those unanticipated cleanup costs. So that's why they had gotten 2 grants from each of us. And those grants totaled over $2 million. The site got a certificate of completion for their cleanup in December of 2020, and now it is a 204,000 square foot office warehouse building known as Arbor Lakes Corporate Center, and it's currently 96% leased. So next, Marcus can tell us about some of the grant priorities that they use from the Met Council.
Right, thank you, Kristen. So like DEED, the Metropolitan Council is also looking for sites that are significantly contaminated. But in addition, we're looking for sites that support equitable environmental protection and sites that connect well to regional services. So in our case, we're talking about things like taking transit and then, or even alternatives like regional biking trails or at the local level, like walking. They could have access to parks and trails. We look at sites that are vacant sites within the development area, redevelopment sites, or places where maybe reuse of the existing building makes the most sense. Similar to DEED, we're looking for, when it comes to the construction, the future project, we're looking for that increase in the tax base. So the redevelopment, it cannot be tax exempt. We're also looking for jobs, particularly living wage jobs. When we think of the project side, thinking of equitable redevelopment projects, we really focus on the type of project that will have some aspect of wealth creation for people who are known to have unequal access to jobs or large disparities in median income in our region. So if you could think of things like maybe examples of that could be like a micro business or a different ownership model that offers equity. So something maybe like a cooperative. As was mentioned in that earlier question, we do support redevelopments that add affordable housing. For us, we're looking at anything that's affordable below 60% of the area median income. And the emphasis is really on that lower scale. So if a project is offering housing at, for example, 30% of area median income or below, that's even more favorable. So these grants are 3-year grants, terms rather. So when it comes to readiness, in addition to kind of when that will start, we're looking at those financing commitments, how, to give us some indication. But we also want to know a little bit about how the development team has conducted its community engagement. We want to know how the development meets a local demonstrated need and some kinds of assurances from the applicant and the development team that they have the capacity to manage the project, spend that funding soon, and comply with reporting requirements if a grant is awarded. So let's take a look at an example in Minneapolis. This is an example of a moderately sized renovation project that was also within a large redevelopment area with a lot of construction activity. The city of Minneapolis first applied on behalf of developer here in 2018. The site was in very rough shape, as you can see by the photo. It was once used for machining and storage at the long vacant Harris Machinery building. It had had a fire and the roof had collapsed. And there were also 2 other smaller buildings on the site that were expected to be demolished. So our applications, just like these, are relative. We compare the evaluation criteria relative to others that are applying in the same cycle. So relative to the other competitors, this project initially just scored, it applied a couple times. So initially it just scored below our minimum score of 75 out of 150 points. And so it wasn't qualified. It did apply a second time. It had qualified for the funding with a couple of changes in the competition and a little bit more information about the readiness. But at that point, we had kind of reached our limit on funding, so we weren't able to recommend this project get a grant award. But as luck has it, the third try was the best try. So this site was a good candidate on the third try, again, because it was moderately contaminated. Remember, all of the sites that apply to us are contaminated. So this is not necessarily, what we're looking at is degrees of contamination. The site had quite a bit of asbestos that had been mixed in with that debris after the fire damaged the building. There was a hazardous waste tank in there. There was petroleum sludge that needed to be removed. That sludge had been mixed with lead. So there was a significant amount of problems that related to VOCs and PAHs, all above MPCA regulatory limits. When we think about the redevelopment, it was going to be a new food hall. It was going to result in a moderate annual tax base increase of over 50,000, and it had a modest number of new jobs. Of 38 jobs, probably about 11 or 12 of them were looked to be living wage jobs, which is something we are interested in. In terms of what we call kind of connected development, the site was intensifying the use of a long vacant site. It was very close to light rail and well-used bikeways. It was expected to have a new regional trail link nearby. It was also adding kind of new features to the area, new sidewalks, stormwater management where there wasn't any before. When we first got it, on this third try, it was expected to start within the year. The site had significant but moderate need for public support when compared with the competition. It was probably about, the environmental aspect was probably about 3% of the total development cost. But what I really want to point out here is a project doesn't need to meet all of the grant criteria to be competitive. This was a site that did okay on a number of factors that we look at, rather than really excel at just 1 or 2 things. And I also want to point out that aspect of, a repeat application can be successful. And a lot of that has to do with the amount of funding that's requested from the project and other competitors, and kind of modest improvements that can be made over time in terms of things like readiness. So I mentioned it was a food hall. So this project opened in 2021. It's an innovative food hall called the Market at Malcolm Yards. There's a number of vendors in there, new and experienced chefs. They change from time to time. You can see they tried to reuse some of the building that had been damaged, really kind of keep that historic look. In this case, it received 2 grants. Again, one from DEED and one from the Metropolitan Council. So you can see that you can stack the funding together if you qualify for more than one source. And I want to point out that, sometimes the sources aren't brownfield sources. In this case, this project also received early support, $300,000 from a Hennepin County transit-oriented development account. So next, we're going to have Michael talk to us about an example with Hennepin County and their cleanup grant priorities. Michael?
Thank you. So Hennepin County is looking at for sites that are significantly contaminated. That could be, soil, groundwater, and we're seeing more and more soil vapor. They're located in infill brownfield properties or possibly orphan sites that are neglected in noticeable disrepair or blight. They demonstrate that they are ready to begin cleanup or construction we're looking for city council letter of approval. Just for example, in Minneapolis, county is looking for future construction on those sites that includes municipal and other public development projects, affordable housing projects where contamination issues preclude redevelopment, or projects that promote economic development. And we're also prioritizing development that includes sustainable features, as we've discussed on other projects, activities that include project design, construction, operation. This slide, we're looking at Edmondson Flats. It's in the city of Edina. They applied for a Hennepin County ERF grant in 2019. The site had been used by a variety of commercial businesses that included a cell phone company, a carpet and drapery cleaner, and recently by a laundry and dry cleaning business that since 2002. And it looks like it incurred around $700,000 in cleanup costs. It was a vacant site. The site included, proposal was to include 62 affordable apartments. So the site was impacted by chlorinated solvents, tetrachloroethylene and trichloroethylene, and so it needed a subslab vapor system. And so there was also a modest amount of asbestos in the building that needed to be abated or before demolition. Prior to the owner had installed an active vapor mitigation system in 2017, but continued mitigation would still be needed in the apartment plan for the site. And then although the prior dry cleaner could have been considered a responsible party, the entity had declared bankruptcy sometime before the application was received by us. So it was vacant. The site had been vacant for over a year and purchased by a nonprofit entity related to the city of Edina until the right for development came along. So there's a affordable housing component. Redevelopment plan calls for 62 apartments, affordable apartments with underground parking, mixed rents included 8 units for formerly homeless individuals, 23 units for affordable at 51 to 60% of the area median income, and 23 affordable at 60 to 80% AMI. Just I'd like to mention some of the sustainable features at the site. Due to contamination, infiltration of the rain was not allowed. So stormwater would be managed using underground retention. And there's also a bike fix-it station and bike racks nearby and accessible to a regional trail. The site was exhibited readiness. The city TIF district was approved in 2019. The site was expected to start construction within a year of receiving the grant. The project was completed fully in 2021. It received 2 cleanup grants totaling $648,000. Hennepin County awarded it $247,000, and that was awarded in February of 2020, and $400,000 from Met Council in fall 2019 funding.
So again, there's another example where, in this case, it's a housing project replacing a commercial use, but you can apply for more than one source. So next, we'll take a look at an example from Ramsey County.
Sure. Before we do so, I see in chat there was a question to Michael asking where exactly this former laundry business site in Edina, where is it located?
I believe it's located off of 70th and near 100. So nearby, I think 9 Mile Creek Trail goes east adjacent to it. That gives it approximate location.
All right. Yeah. So now moving on to Ramsey County. Again, a lot of similarities in terms of our cleanup priorities with the other partners. So we are looking for sites that remove safe and unhealthy or blighted property and or converting environmentally unsound sites to a productive use. The degree to which cleanup addresses human health and environmental safety consistent with the end use of the site. If it's located within an environmental justice area as determined by the MPCA, And they've got a map that shows all of those locations in the county. And then again, we're always looking for some degree of balance between city and suburban locations. And that really depends on the specific round. For example, in our most recent round, the majority of our funding went to the city of St. Paul, but we're looking for relative balance between St. Paul and suburban Ramsey County over time. And then we're looking for future construction on those sites that will help economic development by adding or preserving affordable housing projects that are limited by contamination. And again, I mentioned earlier that like special focus on 30% AMI units, but certainly we welcome affordable housing projects at all levels of affordability. We're looking for projects that are going to attract business or create jobs, that are going to increase the tax base with new higher value property investment. And yes, and then additionally, we prioritize development where there's a funding gap that exists after other sources are committed, and where the developer or owner can complete a proposed project in a timely manner, and how quickly the increased tax capacity is going to generate revenue for the county. And in Ramsey County, we expect you to spend your grant within 18 months of HRA approval of the project. And next, we're going to look at a affordable housing project, since that came up earlier. So this is Amber Union, which is located in the city of Falcon Heights, right northeast of the fairgrounds. And the two buildings on the site were built in 1946-47. The larger building was initially the headquarters for the Farmers Grain Union Association, and also included space for a post office, general office, and printing. And the western building was an auto service and repair garage that was most recently used as an event center. So with this project, there were initially some concerns about leaks from old petroleum storage tanks underground, but the primary environmental concern were asbestos and lead-based paint within the buildings that would need to be removed to proceed with renovation of the buildings. And again, looking at our grant priorities this time, we determined that the Amber Union project was a good candidate for an IRF grant because it first had large amounts of contamination. There were large amounts of floor tile and pipe wrap with asbestos that had to be abated, and a lot of lead-based paint that had to be removed to make the building safe for housing. And then mentioned affordable housing. It's expected to add 128 units of affordable apartments in an area identified as an environmental justice area by the MPCA. And it was a bonus for us that it was in a suburban location, but also located on the A line, so within a transit corridor, which is again a synergy that we're looking for. And then property taxes, annual property taxes are expected to increase over $280,000 per year once the project is completed. Also, additionally, there'll be a limited number of permanent jobs supporting the housing in a small retail space. So the need for public financial support was significant, knowing that the cleanup cost was 4% of the estimated total development cost. And again, project readiness is always important. This project started construction in the summer of 2021 after a bit of a delay securing all the financing, but at the time of application, the project was expected to start within a year of receiving a grant. And then next up, I think we're going to see the project kind of incomplete, as it is right now. So outcomes, it received funding from Met Council and Ramsey County IRF. And I mentioned the 128 affordable apartments with a small amount of retail space. The project is expected to be completed by the fall of 2022. The majority of its funding came from Metropolitan Council, nearly $1 million in the fall 2019 funding cycle. So that is a Ramsey County example. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Marcus to talk about seed grants.
Thank you, Martha.
Wait, I'm sorry. I see a comment from Deed. Deed funded this project. Actually, she might be talking about Amundsen, the previous. I was just checking chat to see if there are any questions about that.
No,
Sure.
Deed funded some soil at Amber Union as well.
Ah,
Okay, thank you for that clarification. But that's just another way to say that, sometimes you can take a project that has many needs and you can kind of divide those among different grantors. So I think it's a good way to think about how these grant funds can be used together. But I'd like to share with you an example of another type of grant. So let's say you have a site that you would like to develop, but you haven't figured out your redevelopment plans yet. So if your project site falls into one of the areas on this map here, and I know it's hard to see, and there is a kind of a mapping tool that will be available for this. But if you're in one of these kind of gray striped areas or these green areas, you may qualify for what we call a Seeding Equitable Environmental Development Grant, or a SEED grant from the Metropolitan Council. So these grants are intended for conducting environmental investigation or partial cleanups on sites that don't have an identified redevelopment. So to use the funding for things like soil, or you have to have a limited site investigation, and you've had to have gotten a cleanup plan approved by the PCA. To use the funding for asbestos or lead-based paint abatement, like we saw in the prior example, you would need to have completed an asbestos or lead-based paint assessment. Sites have to demonstrate a potential for the development, but you don't need to, and in fact, you really shouldn't have a redevelopment project ready to go. So if you have a redevelopment project, you should apply in one of the other categories. The grant terms for these types of grants are 2 years. So now we're going to take a look at kind of all of these sources together.
Great, thanks, Marcus. So the big question everybody always asks is, how much money do you have? So I'm just going to talk about deed for a minute. So looking at this chart, you can see that all of our grant rounds are May and November. We all pay for soil vapor, groundwater, kind of that below ground stuff, cleanup. And then some of the programs like Met Council and some of the county programs also can pay to do that interior abatement, so asbestos or lead-based paint. Deed has a matching funds requirement, and I kind of touched on that before. So that's 25%. Part of that 25% can and typically does come from these other granting sources that you see on the chart. So 12% has to come from the city or the developer, but 13, kind of half of that 25% or 13% can come from Met Council, Hennepin, or Ramsey County grant sources or other granting sources. So this just kind of shows when our decisions are made. And again, deed has about $4 million. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's a little less, but we have about $4 million twice a year. So $4 million for May and $4 million for November. So again, costs already incurred, like investigation costs already incurred, we can only use those as match. If your cleanup costs have begun before an award, we can reimburse for that under certain circumstances, just depending on the timing of your cleanup plan. So what about you, Marcus?
So for the Metropolitan Council, as Kristen mentioned, you apply at the same time. We are offering about 2.5 million for cleanup this cycle. And then we have some additional funding for the SEED grant category. Michael, you want to talk about Hennepin County?
Yeah, so we have 2 funding cycles, for a total of 3 million or 1.5 million each round, but we're looking to fund somewhere between 2 million, 2.5 million this spring. How about you, Martha?
Yeah, Ramsey County, smaller county, geographically smaller tax base. So we will have at least $500,000 available in grants in the spring round on May 2nd. Additionally, I just want to give a quick note to folks who are working on affordable housing projects, specifically in Ramsey County. We've got a housing solicitation that's going on right now where we are allowing folks to identify potential IRF eligible expenses during a housing solicitation that closes on March 14th. So if that's something that applies to you and you have questions, feel free to reach out to me so I can connect you to more information.
Right, so here's how to apply. So for most programs, except for deed, see, I like how they give me this slide because I'm the outlier. Most grantors have an online application. Deed does not. And as you also see on this slide, it says delivered to address, and that's not filled in because we are homeless right now. We're in between homes. So my advice would be just to check our website when it gets closer to that May 1st, or actually in this instance, you get an extra free day, May 2nd, because May 1st is on a Sunday. Check closer to that time. We did have some troubles with some earlier applications that we got in. So your best bet is, if you're in the metro area, to drop your application off at the address provided. Closer to that time, it's probably going to be the First National Bank building, which is our current location, and we'll have instructions on how to do that. Otherwise, if you're going to be mailing that, we'll also have instructions, but give us a call because, you know, we just want to know when app is coming so we can know to look for it. But here are the ways that you can apply. And for deed, again, we don't do the online, so you have to drop off actual physical printed out applications. And like I said, our applications are due May 2nd this year instead of May 1st, because that's on a Sunday. But if you're applying to Minneapolis or St. Paul in particular, they do have a pre-application deadline, which is the first week in March. So make sure, if you're not a city, that you're working with your local units of government where your site's located, to see if there's any additional requirements that those cities or local units of government have. Oh, I was just going to say, and I think in an earlier slide, we talked about the response action plan for cleanup has to be approved by the MPCA, and they typically want, you know, kind of 60-day notice on that. So maybe Marcus, you have some other thoughts on when those are due to the MPCA.
That's right. So we are very close to that deadline. If you're if you know that you're going to be doing some cleanup underground, you know, you're going to want to contact the PCA and make sure you get the cleanup plan to them very early. And for example, the city of Minneapolis, they're looking for some type of pre-application in early March here. I believe it's March 11th. But so if you're in a location like that, you really should check with the city staff.
All right, so we have about, I think, 10 minutes left. That's kind of the end of our presentation, but I do have some housekeeping things, and I'll probably, in the interest of time, run through show the rest of the slides with all of our contact information, and then after that, leave it open for questions. So if people have to leave, they can bow out. But if you didn't get your questions answered today, we are having another meeting next week on March 1st called the Ask Me Anything About Brownfield Applications. So if you're filling out your application, or if you have questions that didn't get answered, we're going to be giving a little presentation on that next week. So, and I just want to put in a couple plugs for Minnesota Brownfields is having their Rescape Awards. So all the great projects and others that we talked about today, and projects like them, are recognized by a nonprofit organization known as Minnesota Brownfields, and they give awards to projects annually. And this year their award ceremony is on April 7th, and there's their email. I also don't have a slide for this, but DEED is having a Brownfields and Redevelopment Conference on April 28th and 29th in Breezy Point, and that registration just went live, I believe, while we were in this presentation. So you can go on the DEED website and get more information on that Brownfields and Redevelopment day-and-a-half conference that DEED is hosting. And then I will just pass it on to these. I'll let you put up our contact information, but while Marcus is showing all of our contact information, I don't know if we want to answer some more questions, or if anybody has a question or wants to raise their hand and be unmuted. Or we can look kind of in the chat here. I'm not sure there's a lot that's new. There was a question for multifamily developments. Are benchmarks or goals for the number of units that meet the 30 to 40% AMI thresholds? I'm going to let those of you who score on affordable housing answer that question.
This is Michael with Hennepin County. Yes, we do have different criteria that score depending on what you come in on for your affordable housing. But we definitely have a metrics for any percentage, and it doesn't make or break a project. It just gives us more information and how to evaluate versus other projects that might have different components.
Should I piggyback on that, and then we can send it up to you, Marcus? I would say that Ramsey County is quite similar to what Michael said for Hennepin County, that like we don't have a hard and fast benchmark for number of units. It really depends on the project as a whole and like what are the goals, all of the different criteria that we shared earlier that are the things. So certainly including 30% of AMI units is going to result in your project scoring better, but there isn't kind of a rigid percentage that's required in order to receive an IRF grant.
So for the Metropolitan Council, what we're looking for overall, for at least 20% of the units to be considered affordable if you have a mix of affordable and market rate units. But as was mentioned here already, we really are prioritizing the ones that are the most affordable. So we're going to ask you to kind of list it out, each of the tiers, each of the kind of price number of units in each of those tiers, and that's how we evaluate.
For DEED, we don't score on affordable housing. We do fund multi-family housing, but our priorities are commercial and industrial. We also had a question on when costs are eligible and whether or not activities can take place, cleanup activities before the award. I see that Hennepin and Ramsey answered in the chat. Hennepin said that you can incur costs once you get board approval. Ramsey County said costs can be incurred as of the date of the application. So all the way back to, I imagine, May 2nd in this case. DEED, it depends on the activity. Like I said, investigation costs we can't reimburse for if they've already incurred. Cleanup costs we can if you've already begun your cleanup, but your RAP has to be less than 6 months old, your RAP approval. So it sort of has to be approved in between those grant rounds. So if it's older than the last grant round and you've started the work, then that work's not eligible. Marcus?
So when we look at grants, we would, if you're applying for, it differs if you're applying for investigation grant or a cleanup grant somewhere. We're looking for eligible activities that were done relatively recently. For us, that's 180 days from the application date. So if you're doing an investigation, you've done some prior investigation, we could count that as match. But if you want to use grant funds for any of those activities, it really has to be after the date of grant award. So same thing with the cleanup. If you've done some investigation work that you haven't received public funding for before, it's relatively recent, 180 days. You could include that in your cleanup request. If you get a grant, we would reimburse that. But if you want to start new work paid for using grant funds, you have to wait till after the grant is awarded.
I see another question in the chat asking if any of the agencies have an up-to-date brownfields or contaminated site map, preferably online, that we can share with us. I know if that question comes to Ramsey County, my response is going to be that you want to go to, oh, there we go. Marcus, we were in synergy here. What's in my neighborhood? You read my mind, Marcus.
I read both of your minds as well. Unfortunately, I just sent my response to Michael instead of the group.
Yep, that would be my response too.
It's a great tool. All right, any other questions for the last 2 minutes?
I did have just something to kind of remind everyone. There was a lot of talk surrounding about affordable housing, and I know I'm new to the to the county, but just doing some of our projects, there are other aspects that we, look at. I know a couple projects come to mind of school or a childcare component that don't have that affordable housing. So we, when we talk about the different criteria that we weigh everything about against, just something to keep in mind is that we have been looking for, the out of the box ideas that aren't typical. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
And with that in mind, we encourage you to talk to us about potential projects that you have, potential sites. Even if we can't fund it, we will do our best to refer you to a source that could help you. So early notice, getting some information on that is usually to your benefit. All right. Well, we really appreciate you spending your time with us today, learning about Brownfield grants and the opportunities that can help you kind of with your own redevelopment goals. We appreciate being able to share kind of the different types of grants, how you get them, what we're looking for. But we know that there may be some questions about that. We're going to send out some materials with these slides. So if you think about it later, you want to contact one of us again, we'll be happy to help. So that really is the end of our program, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you.